Hello and welcome to the Ponding Papaya podcast for your review of a thrilling Canadian Grand Prix. To recap all of the action, I'm joined by F1 journalists Daniel Valente and Ed Spencer, so let's get straight into it. So joining me now is Ed and Daniel, and guys, I think you'll both agree with me. I mean, you may disagree, but I'd be very surprised. For me, that's an early race of the season contender. I don't know about you guys. Ed, let's start with you. What were your overall thoughts of the race?
Definitely the best race of the year. By far, it had everything you wanted, which was action, drama, compelling strategies, good driving with tricky conditions. Yeah, I think it was definitely the one that we'd all been waiting for, and it had to be Montreal. Montreal always seems to produce these very good races, and it delivered again.
Yeah, you're right. It had pretty much everything. We had weather, we had tires, we had three different people in the lead, three different people who could potentially win the race, which I can't remember the last time that happened. Daniel, what about you? I mean, obviously you're the resident Canadian here. What are your thoughts going into the race first of all, but then also the race itself?
I was kind of expecting, a close race like this, but I thought Ferrari would be up there initially going into the weekend. Mercedes was kind of the dark horse, and I think they took a lot of people by surprise too. But this race was just incredible, and I try to say that with no bias as being Canadian myself. But it seems like anytime you get Montreal, you get changing conditions, a wet, dry, you get a classic, and I think today was another one of those. And I think it was just brilliant in the sense that anytime you have, like you're saying, where you put all the best parts about Formula One on display, which is, so it comes down to strategy, different tires, a close, tight field, especially at the front. You put all that together and you're going to get a classic like this was. And I think definitely, race of the season, probably the best race since, I don't know when.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think of a similar race, and I was going to bring up Zandvoort maybe, but then even then, Max was pretty much going to win the whole time, wasn't he? Even then, there didn't seem as much jeopardy as there was this time around. So at least we maybe going back to even 2021. I mean, that's how boring F1's been for the last few years. It's been a long, long time since we've had a race this competitive, like you've both mentioned. And I think you're both exactly right. A lot of teams look like they could actually win, which makes a massive change. Usually how we do this show is I sort of do each driver as one by one, but there's so much happened. I've literally broken it down into phases. So I think that's probably a good good way to go about it, really. I'm sure everyone was seeing, so obviously Norris started third, finished second. Piastri started fourth, finished fifth, unfortunately. So going up and down one place, or depending on who they are. So let's start with the very start of the race. And obviously it was exciting straight from the off because as we all saw it, the rain clouds were over Montreal pretty much all day. I think it'd be fair to say, and then it wasn't exactly raining at the start of the race, but it was wet enough. I mean, Ed, that opening period, what did you make of it? In terms of how McLaren did? Because obviously they weren't flying out the blocks. That came a little bit later, but they both did well. I'd imagine in your eyes to sort of stay in the hunt, stay in the chase, and as we so often see in wet tracks, it's so easy to go off, isn't it? So that was probably mission done for them, wasn't it? Just to stay on track in the hunt, really.
I think they had two objectives. First off was keep the car out of the barrier, which they did, and also the second thing was to hold the gap between them and Verstappen and Russell, and that's what they did. Oscar and Lando put in a very good opening stint, and then once the Kevin Magnussen show, a former McLaren driver himself, having a very good opening stint, putting on a bit of a show. Once that show had kind of hit the buffers, both McLaren drivers could settle back and get back into the rhythm, and Lando really could start hassling Max when he seemed a little bit vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Max in a bit because that was one of my favourite parts of the race. Obviously, going into the race, he was the last guy to score points for McLaren at this venue. That's how long it's been. But him and teammate Nico Hülkenberg, the only two drivers to go on the full wet. And I don't know about you guys, but it felt like at the start when you play the F1 game, but you turn the difficulty all the way down. Because Magnussen was just flying by people, and he was up near the top runners for a long time. It was great to watch, wasn't it, Daniel, to sort of see that unusual car flying by McLaren's, Mercedes, whatever.
It's like you're saying, when you put the AI down to 10, on F1, and you're just letting it rip. Yeah, it was fun, and going back to what I was saying, it's that whole different tire things. You get different variants of what can happen, and I think Magnussen was a perfect job of that. And even though we knew kind of, eventually the track will come back to the guys on inters, something like that is so fun to watch. I can imagine for a spectator, for a fan, for a media, whoever's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I imagine Magnussen himself having a lot of fun because it's not often he's overtaking Ferraris and stuff like that, is it? But yeah, of course, as you mentioned, the track was always gonna be an into one, wasn't it? There wasn't a huge amount of rain, so eventually all the other drivers were on the right tire, really, and that was sort of the key thing. And that's sort of where I want to pick up McLaren's race. Obviously, I think we could all agree that once the opening hustle and bustle sort of died down, the McLaren cars suddenly looked like rocket ships, didn't they? Ed, I'll come to you on this one. That second phase of the first stint, if that's not narrowing it down too much, but they were unbelievably quick, weren't they? And Norris and Piastri were both flying up the order.
Yeah, Norris was just on the charts. I think his performance in the opening stint was mightily impressive because he could sense that the longer George kept Max behind, the more time he was going to gain on both of them, and that's what he did. Plus, Oscar was keeping up, so they both almost worked together in that sense. And then when Lando got by, there was a real feeling that McLaren have got a good chance here, and I think it just again shows how good that car has become ever since the first few flyaways. McLaren have just got better and better and better, and it showed this weekend because they were right at the front.
Yeah, we'll get on to McLaren's competitive because that is something I want to talk about because obviously it's another circuit they've done well at. But just picking on something you said there, because obviously we had Piastri and Norris quite close to each other. How big an impact, Daniel, do you think having two cars on the same team close together had for both the drivers? Because yes, Russell and Hamilton were vaguely close to each other, but they weren't able to work off each other till pretty much right at the end. Whereas McLaren had pretty much an ace up their sleeve, didn't they, by having both drivers that close together and be able to use a little bit of tactics to help them move up the grid.
Yeah, I think it totally opens up the strategy game where now you have two drivers, especially who get along well. There's no real friction there, so you can use those guys in two different ways. If you need to pull Piastri along or pull Lando along, today was more Piastri, but you can do that, and then you have another front runner who can offset. For example, George, who's the only Mercedes car that was up front for a bit, and then Max, and because I think you can see the polar opposite there with Red Bull, where it's kind of a one-man show, and they don't have a second gunner to offset what McLaren could potentially do, and I think that's one of the key benefits that McLaren has, and Ferrari on its good days too, when Charles and Sainz are up there as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right to bring up that Red Bull point. It's a fascinating one, isn't it? A few days after his future is confirmed, Sergio Perez puts in possibly the worst race of his career, if that's not being too harsh. I mean, did he do anything right? I mean, there was crashes, there was poor qualies, there was destroying a rear wing. I mean, I don't know if Red Bull are going to be looking for a clause to get out that contract already, Ed, but that was a terrible race of Perez. Just touch on him, really.
Yeah, nothing went right. Nothing went right. Full stop. The qualifying was poor. The race was really poor. Rookie mistake to go out and damage the rear wing. It's going to be an interesting thought for Christian Horner because he's apparently signed this guy for 2 years. Although now we know it's a 1 year. Plus, it's likely there'll be another year performance hints on him. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's not been a good weekend for former McLaren driver Checo Perez. Probably one of his worst. But I think Spain he'll be back.
Yeah, you expect so. He seems to be one of those drivers that can hopefully get himself out of a rut. I mean, he's not had a great time of it late. But let's move on to the safety car then. So obviously, speaking of drivers who have not had a good time of it lately, Logan Sargent, he appeared. He got onto the TV screens by ramming into the wall and bringing out the safety car. Obviously, at this point in time, Norris was top. He a small mistake from Max Verstappen, which we don't say very often, allowed Lando Norris to go up into first. And then there's a lot of, watching it, initially I thought the safety car just came out too late. But hearing from Norris, it sounds like it was the team's decision actually to keep Norris out. So at the time of the safety car, he had an 8-second lead, and obviously he pits a lap later than everyone else, by which time he's caught up the safety car. and he eventually comes out into P3. And Daniel, I don't know about you, but this seemed like a really pivotal moment in the race, doesn't it? And I feel like if something goes a little bit different, Lando could probably win quite easily. But I mean, this was really crucial to him not winning, would you say?
Yeah, I think even like going back to Miami, it's like the safety car gives and the safety car takes. Yeah, that's just racing sometimes, right? And even like to your point, I went back and I was watching the onboards just to see at what point, McLaren were like communicating. And I know like it's a little bit delayed when you watch on F1 TV. And they did discuss coming in, but at that point he was already on um, the main straight. So I don't know if you account for like the couple seconds in delay, it would have been a really tight, I don't even know if possible, like call. And yeah, that kind of changed the whole complexion of the race at that point. The race went from being in McLaren's hands to now they would have to strategize or do something on track to, get back in a position of power. Um, can you say did that cost him the win? Potentially, but I think as we all saw today, there was so much chaos and different unexpected things that it's almost impossible to say like what could have happened from then on and if that could have changed the race in any way.
Yeah, just on that point, I do sort of want to bring in what Norris said after the race. So he said this in the press conference. He said, we should have won today. It's as simple as that. We didn't do a good job or a good enough job as a team to box when we should have done and not get stuck behind the safety car. So I don't think it was lucky or unlucky. It wasn't the same as Miami. This was just us making a wrong call by me and the team, and it's something we'll discuss after, but we should have won today. And Ed, coming to you, that is quite strong words, isn't it? I mean, we all know that Norris is quite pessimistic at the best of times, but here he's really like signaling out that the team or him made a bad choice, not the safety car came at the wrong time.
I think that's a good sign that he's not blaming one person on the other. He's taking responsibility, as is the team. That's good for team unity and good morale for team morale. I think it's a case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Lando was just ahead to the safety car just as he pitted, so it would have maybe had there would have potentially been a pit lane infringement if he'd entered the pit unsafely. So I think it's one of those, bad luck, bad timing, really, for him. But he had a chance to rebound.
Oh, sorry, carry on.
No, I'm finished.
And yeah, he came out just ahead of Piastri, so obviously losing 2 spots behind Russell and Verstappen. And then we're sort of into the next phase of the race, and it was quite funny watching along. Like there was this threat of rain, wasn't there? This whole time they were talking about in 20 minutes' time there's going to be rain, in 10 minutes' time there's going to be rain, and we sort of got to the rain. It was a little bit, wasn't it? It wasn't a huge amount. It wasn't exactly like torrential floods, but it was enough to validate the decision to go on to Inters. As we all saw with Charles Leclerc, obviously he was the first driver to go on the slicks and had just a dreadful time, not just the tyres related. But yeah, what did you make, Daniel, of sort of that second stint of McLaren, especially Norris as well? Because he then went for the opposite approach of gambling, staying at 2 laps later than Russell and Verstappen, and ultimately, did that cost him again for sort of being in the lead? Because he did come out just ahead of Verstappen, but lost that position straight away.
Yeah, it almost felt like with the McLaren today, like they were quick. Don't get me wrong, but it almost felt like they were the fastest in changing conditions. And then when it came to like being straight on the inter in wet or on dry, like towards the end of the race, it almost felt like they weren't there. They were either like second or even third or closely matched with the Mercedes there. So it's just like pretty tough to say in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, Norris was adamant that certainly that helped. He said that kicked in front of Russell. But Ed, do you think that because he stayed out for 2 laps extra, do you think if he does 1 lap extra, gets a little bit of a gap, like Daniel said, McLaren were really quick in that changing conditions. Do you think he comes out ahead and he can sort of stay ahead, or do you think Norris is right and he says no matter what they did, he was going to get overtaken anyway?
I think it would have been very tight, but there is the case that Verstappen's tyres were warmed up by then anyway. 2 laps fresh, 2 laps warmed up, it would have been even tougher for him to stay in that gap. I think the problem was the pit exit was still very damp, and that's why Lando had that slide coming out, because they were virtually neck and neck coming out, and it just, that slide just cost him a little bit. But I think Lando's probably right, damned if you do, damned if you don't. I think we would have the same result.
Yeah, I think it's well worth watching. I mean, that's what I was doing at the time when he's cut the pits. I like to watch Lando's onboards because compared to a lot of other drivers, he gets so much instruction from Will Joseph. Like he's constantly telling like what to do and kind of thing. So it was very interesting seeing firsthand him coming out of the pits, and you're right, having a tiny little moment, but enough for Verstappen to move ahead. And he wasn't the only one to have a few mistakes. Obviously, Verstappen had issues. Russell had issues. It was this next period of the race was sort of defined by who can keep the car on track for the longest, wasn't it? Like Verstappen eventually emerged into the lead. I mean, Norris locked up in the hairpin on lap 49. Russell went by, but then Russell made a mistake and Norris came by. So we had this very changing order, and that went all the way up until we got a second safety car. And I mentioned him earlier, Perez this time didn't cause a safety car, but he sort of started this little run of events where we had a few crashes, a few stuff like that. So Perez crashes it, but then the one that brings out the safety car is Sainz. Sainz spins, takes out Albon, who was just tremendously unlucky being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then again, we had a split strategy, which was very interesting. So Verstappen and Norris didn't pit, whereas the Mercedes behind both Lewis and George then pitted. And the result was Mercedes being really quick at the end, weren't they, Daniel? Like, do you think Norris did well to hang on to his P2? That's how quick these Mercedes were on the dry?
Oh, for sure. I think the Mercedes pace today, I think if we're talking, a couple more things go their way, they potentially could have won that race. You eliminate a couple mistakes, and you easily could have had George Russell on the top step of that podium, or if Hamilton qualified better, he could have been on the top step of that podium. So I think that P2 is like a very well-earned second place for Lando. And, and like you were saying before, it almost just came down to a war of attrition at that point. Mm-hmm. It was basically just, who could survive the longest to get to that point where it was just a straight shootout to the end.
Yeah, and of course, I think if we had like 5 or 10 more laps, you're right. I think Russell in particular was looking very quick. Obviously, he was on the mediums. Hamilton was on the hard, so probably explains a little bit of pace difference. But we can't ignore the impact that Piastri's obviously had on Norris's race and Norris's ability to keep P2, because pretty much while Norris has been trading for first place or whatever, Piastri's been right behind, like we mentioned, like teammates really working well together. But there was a critical moment. I sort of want to get both your opinion on this. Like Piastri going into the corner, then Russell doesn't dive bomb him, but is quite aggressive. They make contact. Russell ends up slowing down. Hamilton overtakes, and then Russell obviously overtakes again eventually. But Ed, I'll come to you first on this. What did you make of that incident? Because it is something that's been referred to the steward. I mean, they've taken so long that we're recording and they haven't given us a verdict, so this might be all entirely irrelevant by the time it comes out. But Ed, what did you make of that incident, ignoring what the stewards thought of it?
I think it's very, very clear that George went for a gap that wasn't there. You can't get 2 cars through that corner, not in a million years. And Oscar kind of just had to hold his ground, and he did the job. And ultimately, it messed George up a bit more because he lost ground to Lewis. So George tried to play a risky game, and it didn't work. And in fact, he lost more than he gained. And I mean, for me, it's not a penalty. I think it's just simply a reprimand and maybe a fine if you wish. I don't think it's worth changing the classification of the results, but it was a bit of a cack-handed move.
And just following on that, did you think him doing that stops him being able to attack Lando? Because obviously, like you mentioned, he loses time to both Piastri again, but then also he has to get past his teammates. So if you think he doesn't go for that move, does he have a chance later on to attack Norris a bit more than he did?
I think it's the case that he probably would have had more time, but Piastri was playing rear gunner to Lando anyway. So I can see Oscar playing a little bit harder and trying to block him, trying to defend a little bit more down the straights, perhaps. Then once Oscar realised that the Mercs were quicker, he just kind of let him go almost. So I think it would have made George's job even harder.
What about you, Daniel? Are you agreeing that it was sort of maybe a racing incident, but more Russell to blame, or are you a different mind?
If I was one of the stewards, I think I would deem it Russell more at fault. Obviously, I mean, that was a highly optimistic move. Especially with these regulations of cars, you consider the weight, the size of them. That move is just not going to happen. If you do it 100 times, you're maybe lucky if you pull it off once. And the only way you're pulling it off is if the guy alongside you completely backs out. And Piastri had no reason to back out. That was his corner. So I think it was just a very opportunistic move by Russell, and in no way was that ever on. Now, if I was a steward, the same thing. I wouldn't penalize it. I think it's more so just kind of a racing incident. I don't think it's worth changing the classification, but definitely a very opportunistic move by Russell. And I think it's something we see a lot with George, where it almost seems like every time there's a time crunch or he's chasing and, the laps are dwindling, he's more prone to, maybe not keeping his head on straight or letting cooler heads prevail. And you'll see him, lose focus or try something that's not there. And it leads to these mistakes.
Why do you think that is interesting? Because I sort of agree with you, and I think it was something that was picked in the commentary. He does make a lot of mistakes, and yet he's into his 5th season, the same as Lando. We're not really seeing those kind of mistakes from Lando. Do you think this is going to be something that stays with Russell throughout his career, or do you think it's still just him being relatively young and relatively fresh?
I think it's probably just a bit of being relatively young and relatively fresh. Even he's been in F1 for a number of years, but he's only been at Mercedes for a couple now. And when you have a teammate like Lewis Hamilton, it almost feels like you're always trying to, or he might always be aware that he's always going to be measured to him. And I think joining a team like Mercedes, where they were very dominant in the previous era, and now they're kind of struggling, he is very eager to make a lasting impression. I know he had the win in Brazil there, but it almost feels like he's always wanting more instead of sometimes just, biding your time and picking your spots more thing. I think it might be more of an on-track maturity thing, and maybe that comes to him. We've seen drivers definitely, someone like a Max who kind of matured as he started racking up more accolades. So, it's always possible that George goes that route too and eventually becomes that.
Mm-hmm. And Ed, just following off of that, if you had a race tomorrow, who are you putting in your car, George or Lando?
If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said George. Today, I would say Lando. Hands down.
And sort of him, Albon, and Leclerc and Russell obviously all get mixed in quite a lot. Like, are we now seeing that Lando sort of progressed to the front of that, or do you think Leclerc was always sort of billed as the one with the most talent? Do you think that's still sort of the case, or do you think Lando's now up there with him?
I would say Lando's up there, even though I would put Charles just ahead. Lando is definitely second in that group, and then it goes George and, of course, Alex. But but he's progressed so much as a driver, you could easily make an argument for him being on par with Leclerc.
And just one moment I wanted to pick up from this sort of sequence we were talking about. I mean, it was interesting for me. Like, they asked Oscar, if we let you overtake Lando, pretty much, are you going to be able to attack Verstappen? And I don't know about you, but I thought it was quite an unusual response. He said, I'm busy like defending Russell behind. Like, Daniel, coming to you on this, like, it's not often we hear a F1 driver not want to overtake a car, is it? I mean, were you surprised by that radio message as well?
I think from a competitive aspect, you could definitely be surprised that someone is turning down an opportunity to go attack the leader. With that being said, though, I think ultimately it was the right call. Even I don't know if it was intentional or not, because if he has to overtake Lando, then Lando's got to kind of slow up so Piastri can get by him, and now you're inviting George, who is still on Piastri's tail, right there, and Lewis is right there as well. So yeah, definitely an odd response. It caught me by surprise too, and it was one of those moments where you try to imagine yourself in the cockpit, and you're like, I would definitely take that opportunity to go chase the leader. But ultimately, I think it was probably the right decision and saved McLaren from even getting in a more tight situation there with now Russell could be right on Lando's tail, and if he gets past Lando, he's right back behind Piastri, let's say.
Yeah, that of course brings us to the end of the race. Lando finishing on the podium for the 5th time in the last 7 races, obviously in the form of his career at the moment. Oscar finishing in P5. And if anyone listened to our previous show, Sarah did say this exact order, which I very much respect. That's the closest anyone's ever come with our predictions, so very much well done to her. Moving on to the race as a whole, like obviously a huge amount of points scored for the team, which is great compared to what Ferrari did. So I'll give you the running orders. So obviously Verstappen still first, 194 points, Leclerc on 138, and then Norris into third. Well, he's always in third, but very much closer to Leclerc now on 131. And then a bit of a gap now down to Sainz in 108. Piastri, meanwhile, is in 6th on 81. So I'm going to be looking at that P2 battle. I mean, it's getting close, isn't it, Ed? Like, Leclerc's just 7 points ahead now, which seems mad after his weekend in Monaco last time.
Yeah, it's definitely closing in for Lando, in the 7 points behind now by Charles because, of course, Charles didn't have a particularly good weekend and Lando, of course, got P2. But they're really starting to pull away a little bit from Oscar at P6. But really, it's the two-way battle has been split into two groups with Charles and Lando leading that battle and Carlos and Sergio drifting back a little bit. So it's the fight for P2 is getting really intense now. The fact that the points margin is so close shows the level of consistency both teams and both drivers are putting in. Obviously, Charles didn't have that. Charles had a bit of a horrible weekend, but yeah, I mean, 9 times out of 10, Ferrari and McLaren have been pumping in good results. So it's one thing we should be watching for when we get back to the European season.
Mm-hmm. And Daniel, who would your money be on going for the rest of the year? Because, I mean, is it fair to say that Ferrari have like the higher highs but the lower lows? Because obviously they've won more races than McLaren this year, but they've also had dreadful times like they did in Canada. So do you think McLaren's consistency is probably going to win out over the course of the year?
I think with the form McLaren has shown and even the consistency, I think you'd be foolish not to bet on them. I mean, Ferrari won 2 races this year. One of them was when McLaren did not have the upgrades at the time. Red Bull had Max DNF, and then Monaco, which is a very specific niche circuit. So I think especially as we start going into Europe here and we start getting back on the traditional track, and as we move to tracks like Barcelona, Silverstone, Hungary, these are tracks where I'm expecting McLaren to have the edge over Ferrari, unless some unforeseen upgrades come for Ferrari. But just as it is right now, my money would be on McLaren and Lando overtaking Charles in this very tight and very entertaining battle for second place.
And even in the constructors, it's getting ridiculously tight now because obviously no point score for Ferrari means that McLaren now just 40 points behind Ferrari, which it seems quite mad considering where they were after the first couple of races. So I just also want to touch on McLaren. I mean, we've all hinted at it throughout the episode, but the competitiveness over a lot of different tracks. So Ed, coming to you on this, they've done well now at pretty much every kind of track, haven't they? This time last year, sorry, not this time last year, but when they got the upgrades last year, it was very clear that high to medium speed circuits was what they were really good at, and maybe not so much at low speed circuits. Yeah, we've seen in Monaco, and now we've seen here as well that they are very strong at all tracks, and I think that's probably going to be their biggest strength going forward, isn't it? That they're not so circuit specific as they've been for a long, long time.
I think that's quite the case. I think every kind of circuit McLaren have been strong at. There's no real track which you look at and think it's a complete weakness. China, for example, a lot of people were saying this is not going to be our track, and what happens? Lando's on the podium. So I think again, it's a testament to how good that car is, and the fact that it's good on all kinds of circuits, and it can fight with the Red Bulls and the Ferraris of the world for victories and more. So yeah, I can definitely see when we get back to Europe and we get more upgrades that McLaren can get even better in terms of results. I definitely can see another couple of wins coming.
Yeah, I think that's entirely fair. I mean, they're probably second favourite, would you say, now to get the wins? I mean, Dan, let's touch on Mercedes a little bit because obviously they've had a hugely great weekend. I mean, their form's come out of nowhere, really, considering where they've been all year, all last 2 years, not just this year alone. Do you think this is a flash in the pan, or do you think this is sort of a trend that they're going to be now up there with the McLarens, the Ferraris, and the Red Bulls?
I'm not quite sure I would say they would be up there just yet, or at least I wouldn't be confident in saying that. I think you're going to start to see an upward in form, like we saw today in Montreal, where, Montreal is a track where they've notoriously been good at too. So I think even when we get to Barcelona, Hungary, certain tracks where they are known to excel, we'll probably see some strong form then. And then I think if you just combine it with, they're obviously starting to understand the car more. They know how to get it into maybe good, better setup windows when it comes to these tracks that they are traditionally strong at. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more flashes in the pan like today we saw in Montreal. I don't know if I would put them at the level of a McLaren or Ferrari yet. I would need to see this more consistently because I think, as we all have seen with Mercedes, they seem to be a case where 1 week they look great and then the next week it's, we don't understand anything kind of thing. But it's definitely encouraging, and as more upgrades keep coming, I think they do have a better understanding of where their car is now.
Yeah, you're 100% right to point out that. I mean, we can go back to like Sao Paulo 2022, can't we? Where everyone thought, oh, their problems are over, and here we are almost 2 years later, and not everything's been fixed. That sort of like rounds us up for what McLaren does in the race. I mean, we can take a look at the other runners and riders, just have a little bit little look down the grid. Obviously, we've touched on Red Bull with Perez not doing well. We've touched on Ferrari. We've touched on Mercedes. So I want to take it to RB, which is obviously sort of, I think we could all say the team that's leading the bottom half. They've done well so far. A lot of focus on Daniel Ricciardo going into this weekend, wasn't there, Ed? And I'm not helped by Jacques Villeneuve's comments. I mean, if you haven't seen them, it's well worth checking them out for an absolute attack on Ricciardo's character as well as his driving ability. So, how good do you think Ricciardo's going to feel having put in that kind of performance, P5 in quali, and then a good point score to go along with it?
I think it'd be relief because, he's been knocking on the door in the races, but it's never quite happened, particularly in Imola, for example, where he got into Q3 and ultimately the race just didn't pan out. So he'll be relieved to get points in a race because the only points I believe he's had this year in the sprint to Miami. I think what RB have got is a very competent midfield car which could challenge the likes of Aston Martin for P5 if there's a suitable swing. Of course, Yuki Tsunoda didn't get the points today, and Fernando and Alonso and Lance Stroll got, I believe, 6th and 7th, which is a double point for them, and it's crucial. So, what RB are doing at the moment is very much a case of what AlphaTauri were doing in 2021, where they were fighting for a good haul of points on most weekends, and then maybe occasionally a podium. Now, whether they'll get a podium this season, it's very doubtful because, of course, the top 10 at the moment are very much set in their ways and very much likely to get the podiums. But there's definitely a feeling that they are leading the midfield, particularly also with the fact that Alpine have dropped off at the start of the season.
Yeah, definitely, and we could touch on Alpine, I guess, as the final thing we talk about today. A double point score, which obviously I don't think it's happened this year. I could be wrong, but it's very unusual if it has. But yet more trouble, isn't there, brewing at Alpine? I mean, Ocon got told this week that he's no longer wanted for next year. He's got a new drive somewhere else, which he hasn't revealed yet. But any positivity they had about their race was pretty much undone, wasn't it, by Ocon in the post race press conferences? Basically saying that he was told that he was going to get the position back over Gasly. He got asked to move to side. He didn't do it. Gasly didn't get a chance to go attack Ricciardo ahead. Basically, just a very messy situation, wasn't it, Daniel? Like, it's not a good look when you've got two teammates that not aggressive towards each other, but not really helping each other out. As we said with McLaren earlier, like they're the perfect teammate combo, and perhaps this teammate combo is the exact opposite of that.
This feels like a marriage where both sides are just counting down the days until that divorce papers are finalized and they can walk away from this season. And, we still got, how many more races to go? We still have 15 more, 14 more races, 13 more races, and this is only happening now. And both sides already know they're walking away, they're going separate ways. So I can't even imagine how much worse this can get almost as we keep moving along the season. And it almost feels like Ocon is almost being baited into doing something where the team can, unleash some kind of discipline or, similar to what we saw in Monaco.
Yeah, it's all very messy. And I mean, Ed, final question for you. Where does Ocon go from here? Like, he's going to have to go for a step down, isn't he, surely? I know Alpine aren't great so far, but at least they're an engine supplier. They've got a lot of backing behind them. Like, surely he's going to be looking down the grid rather than up it.
Yeah, well, nearly all of the top seats are filled except Mercedes, but they seem very keen on Kimi Antonelli. So he's really got three options, which are Audi, Williams, and Haas. Haas is an interesting project, but at the moment it seems very much like Ferrari's B team. Williams, they seem very set on Carlos Sainz, although Carlos doesn't really know where he's going. Audi has been more of an option, and I can see him potentially going for Audi due to the fact that it is going to be a factory team, and he knows how a factory team works, so he can give his expertise along with Nico Hülkenberg for the future as they try to help Audi get their footing in the F1 door. But he really hasn't got that much time to get, because we could be, by the time we go for summer break, virtually all the top seats could be gone, and there might be one or two drivers left, and he'll have to have stiff competition.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we seem to be in a period now where every couple of days we get a new driver announcement, but that is one we will keep an eye out for. I'm sure Ocon will let his plans be known in the near future. But that about wraps it up for today. I mean, a great race for McLaren, really, even if they feel slightly disappointed they didn't get the win, but a good still haul of points for them to take back to Spain next. I mean, my thanks go to both you, Ed, and both you, Daniel. Thanks again for joining me, and yeah, thanks for giving me your time.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to come on.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you, Sam.
My thanks go to both Daniel and Ed for joining me today. And before we go, I want to let you know about a very special episode coming your way. On Saturday, we'll be releasing an interview with Amanda McLaren, daughter of Bruce McLaren, the team's founder, about her father's legacy, her memories of her father, and how she's keeping that legacy going today. So to ensure you're one of the first to hear it, make sure you're subscribed on your favourite podcast platform, give us a rating while you're there, and why not tell your friends about the show so they can listen along too. In the meantime, you can follow us on socials at Pondering Papaya, but once again, thanks for listening.